Welcome to this series of lectures on utopian terror in the 20th century. My name is Veas Gabriel Lilavicius. I teach at the University of Tennessee, and I teach the history of Europe, especially Germany and Eastern Europe in the modern period. Our course of lectures will deal with the violent 20th century. We need to confront a central fact of that age. The 20th century had a remarkably violent record. And thus, in essence, the main question this course will aim to address is why and how has the 20th century been so violent? This question certainly has tremendous urgency. I'd like to outline the reasons. We pride ourselves on our progress and our modernity, but the terrible violence of the century past represents a terrible contradiction and a challenge to that confidence. The past century has been marked by ferocious total wars, implicating entire societies, not simply armies. It has seen the proliferation of the institution of the concentration camp. It saw cases of industrialized mass murder and ethnic cleansing. We need to ask ourselves fundamental questions. What if these phenomena are not merely throwbacks, a recurrence of bygone barbarism, but might, on the contrary, still be signs of things to come? In essence, we need to ask ourselves, what will the next century be like? Will it break with this violent record? Will the next century see the intensification of such phenomena, or, as we all hope, the abolition of such experiences? Scholars have tried to estimate the numbers of the casualties of 20th century wars, civil conflicts, government-sponsored persecutions of their own peoples, and mass murders. It's important to keep in mind that it's difficult to arrive at final statistical estimates of these tragedies. And indeed, in the course of our lectures, we frequently will be discussing probable ranges of the casualties of these atrocities. And I'd like to stress that this in and of itself is a crucial and telling point. It indicates the orders of magnitude of the millions of victims involved. But nonetheless, certain scholars have tried to tackle this grim business of seeking ever more exact estimates. The political scientist R.J. Rummel of the University of Hawaii has compiled a vast database of estimates of casualties worldwide during the 20th century. And those estimates suggest that wars and civil wars, armed conflicts during the course of the 20th century, cost somewhere in the neighborhood of 38 million lives. 38 million lives in wars and civil wars. But there's another horrifying statistic which needs to be laid side by side with this one. And that is the estimated casualties for another phenomenon: government-sponsored persecutions, mass murder, state-organized genocide. These are phenomena that are estimated to have accounted for about 169 million victims, thus far more than the earlier statistic for wars and civil wars alone. We see here, in essence, a contradiction that hovers over the 20th century as a whole. These facts, these dreadful statistics, clearly conflict with the 20th century's great hopes, its aspirations, and indeed the indisputable advances that were made in the course of that age in technology, in medicine, in the physical standard of living, and in social organization. We'll see that paradoxically, very often it was the very lure of progress that was used to justify the century's mass violence, running in tandem with these advances. Further, we need to note that this was an urgent question because it was not merely limited to one continent, not merely centrally located in the atrocities of European civilization, but rather was a worldwide phenomenon in the course of the 20th century. This order of violence has been seen worldwide. In our lectures, we'll consider first of all, in a special way, the case of European history, the outbreak of world wars, the rise of ideologies on that continent, but we'll then expand the focus to keep in mind how these ideas would spread and would be adapted elsewhere around the world. We'll consider the impact of imperialism in spreading ubiquitous state violence to subject populations. We'll consider then how modern ideologies originating in Western civilization would affect other parts of the globe. Our lectures will seek to survey many sites of man's organized inhumanity to man in the 20th century. We'll consider the muddy trenches of the First World War and the barbaric warfare that took place there. We'll examine as well the banks of the Euphrates River, where deported Armenians died in the course of a genocide that was mounted during the course of the First World War. We will look out over the frozen wastes of Stalin's Gulag camps at Magadan in the Far East. We'll consider the barbarity of the Nazi death camps in Hitler's Final Solution and the genocide practiced there. We'll consider also the mass graves closer to our own times of Rwanda in Africa and Srebrenica in the Balkans in Europe, and we'll survey Cambodia's killing fields. While our lectures will obviously not be able to cover all aspects of all of the many tragedies of the 20th century, we will nonetheless attempt to focus in on those that speak to the very largest issues. One might pause for a moment to ask why one would dwell on such terrors, why one would concentrate one's historical and scholarly attention on what seem to be unrelieved stories of human barbarity, cruelty, and unrelieved tragedy. And yet I think it's worthwhile to keep in mind that given the common nature of such tragedies in the 20th century, this is a question of such existential importance to us all that it needs to be faced head on. And that moreover, the cautionary tales, the stories that bid us to be careful in our approach towards politics and human history as such in our own experience are not all that these stories of tragedy present to us. There are also stories of heroic resistance and perhaps models of how these trends might be short-circuited. Let us consider the explanatory framework, the key elements that we'll try to keep in mind as a way of seeking to understand and give coherence to the tragedies we'll be examining. A clear linkage exists between 20th century plans for utopias, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the use of terror to bring them about. These key terms, utopia and terror, are thus terms that we need to take a moment to define. First, the word utopia defines and evokes the notion of an imagined ideal society. The utopian tradition is perhaps as old as mankind itself. It certainly is dated back by intellectual historians to classical times in Western civilization. Such scholars point in particular to Plato's Republic as an example of an imagined philosophically coherent society. But most older conceptions of ideal societies as such were religious in nature. They proposed a golden future in the afterlife, an Eden, a paradise in which human problems would be resolved, in which man would exist in a harmony with the divine. But in modern history, with growing modern secular and scientific thought, especially in Europe and in Western civilization as a whole, a new page was opened in the utopian tradition, one that was decisively different from the earlier religious meaning of utopian thought. With growing secular thought, new thought experiments could be undertaken, ones that did not speak to the divine or supernatural powers, but rather utopias or perfect societies that were intended not for the hereafter, but for the here and now. Heaven on earth, quite literally. The first of these was Sir Thomas More's Utopia in 1516. This was a work that indeed gave its very name to the utopian tradition. It was a work that described a harmonious society based on reason and equality. And all of the ways in which Thomas More defined this ideal society hammered home the point of its harmony and its inner coherence. This was a society that in many ways was intended as a criticism of the social realities which Sir Thomas More saw around in his own day. This was a society that, by contrast with all other known societies, disdained riches, looked on gold with scorn, which was based on shared property and shared prosperity, not on private possessions. It was in essence a welfare state. People would work together, live together, and grow together. Rather than families being divided, the society would meet in common dining halls to take their meals together. All would wear the same clothes to emphasize the commonality of this utopian island. This was to be a society with no privacy, with a strict moral code, a civic religion which was not Christian, but instead would be a philosophical common ground that all could unite upon, and was presented as a utopia. Yet Thomas More's naming of this society was significant. The name he gave to the island of Utopia quite soberly turned the message on its head by suggesting that this might be an impossible dream. In Greek, Utopia was formed out of the words for no and place. In essence, Utopia was a nowhere or a no place. And indeed, intellectual historians continue to argue to this very day about whether Sir Thomas More meant his thought experiment as a realistic suggestion for how society might evolve, or rather whether it was intended as a more pointed and discrete form of criticism. We might say that this contradiction, this sense of the implausibility, given the human realities that we know, of achieving that perfect society, continues to endure and has endured in all thinking about utopias. But in spite of this recognition of the implausibility of many such perfected societies, the word nonetheless still retains in our usage of it, utopia, certain positive connotations. It might signify a dreamlike, idealistic, unworldly view of the world, but nonetheless, there still is in our usage something positive about the notion. It is the lure of a new earth and a new human being in perfect harmony, and for all of its implausibility, perhaps an ideal worth striving after. When we speak of utopianism, then, as a trend, we mean this abiding human trait of visualizing total, comprehensive social solutions and achieving that dream of a perfect society. What we now need to do is to turn to define what seems like a very unlikely pairing for that term of utopia, the concept of terror. Now, terror, in the way we use the word, frequently implies fear, panic, alarm. But it also has a more specific political usage that we want to concentrate on and define here. In this usage, explicitly political, terror is a political method in the pursuit and wielding of power. It denotes the organized use of violence for political, deliberate ends. Terror, thus, when used politically, seeks to instill fear and panic and aims at forcing a deliberate transformation, whether of society or individuals. Thus, terror implies the deliberate and organized targeting of ordinary people, civilians, non-combatants, and innocents, and indeed, terror might be all the more effective precisely because it targets such uninvolved, unpoliticized individuals. Now here too there are certain significant ambiguities in the word's connotations. Earlier revolutionaries accepted or did not reject the label of terrorist. Indeed, they spoke of and praised terror as a tactic. But terrorism and the label terrorist certainly carries a stigma today. We're familiar with that old chestnut, that saying that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. This in many ways is a kind of defensive statement which aims to, as it were, shake the stigma of the label of terrorist, and it's not entirely adequate to the political realities of terrorism, because terrorists quite deliberately aim to target the innocent and the uninvolved, which is not something that all freedom fighters do. Nonetheless, we need to consider the linkage of utopia and terror, and this is united in one particular concept, the concept of ideology. Utopia and terror are an unlikely pairing that have been linked in the history of the 20th century because in the 20th century, plans for perfection presented in terms of ideology encountered either passive or active resistance. If individuals and societies at large would not willingly submit to being radically remade, well then on frequent occasion, compulsion would be used to enforce the planned perfection that was kept in mind. Such terror would in turn be justified in reference to an ideology that, it was said, legitimized the actions of the present by pointing to that bright, far-off future. An ideology is not simply an idea. Ideologies are systems of ideas which purport to explain all of reality. And the modern age has seen a succession of ideologies, systems of thought that describe how the world works, or perhaps how the world should work, if only it could be set right. A whole succession of ideologies are ones that we'll be discussing in this course. Nationalism, socialism, communism, fascism, Nazism, a whole series of isms and ideologies. Because of their promises of ultimate meaning and a perfect future, secular salvation, many ideologies in fact constituted what we might call political religions, which in some sense hijacked many of the earlier religious impulses and now would turn them to political uses, commanding fanaticism, commitment, and sacrifice from true believers. They offered something in return. In return, such ideologies could give their followers enormous confidence. It meant, after all, that such followers, such true believers, were on the right side of history. They were inevitably fated to a kind of immortality by being part of a project that was of necessity about to triumph. And thus, also by implication, such ideologies would give justification to true believers for realizing their beliefs by any means necessary, including the escalating use of violence. In essence, ideologies were ideas that would have consequences. And for that reason, in our lectures, we'll seek to take those ideas seriously and understand how they might impel political action. We need to break down a little further some of the key elements in the rule of such ideological regimes. The 20th century saw the rise of a whole succession of ideological regimes using both utopia and terror, and as a consequence, they would be both dynamic and brutal. Such regimes pursuing criminal policies had four key elements. These constituted, on the one hand, the means, the tools, the instruments for achieving their ends, and the motives, the ends themselves, the final goals that they had in mind. Masses and machines were the two key elements that would make up the means or the tools to achieve the ideological plans, while the mobster elites and the master plans that the ideologies gave them, the blueprints for action, would ultimately show them the way to the future. Let's consider these in turn. The means included masses and machines. Masses of people were mobilized in the rise or consolidation of such regimes, exploiting societies in turmoil, shaken societies that would be full of uprooted and atomized individuals. Humans would be caught up in these ideological movements who were often uprooted members of lonely crowds, seeking escape from their loneliness and promises of belonging, anonymity, and equality in ideological movements. And indeed, we'll see that one crucial recurring image that will show up again and again in our examination of these regimes is the image of the masses, regimented and marching, given purpose, marching off towards an allegedly bright tomorrow dictated by the ideology. Indeed, one of the remarkable witnesses of the 20th century, one of the thinkers whom we'll turn to on occasion for insights, a remarkable international intellectual by the name of Elias Canetti, engaged in a long study of how crowds and masses function, what the internal dynamics of a crowd, a group of people in aggregate, were in terms of mass psychology. In the early 1960s, he produced a masterwork of his insights entitled Crowds and Power. This work was a formidable and fascinating study of sprawling erudition, fairly bursting with insight and provocative thoughts on every page. Crowds and Power argued that the masses in the modern period were increasingly organized and drawn into political life. They were drawn into politics, in particular by the rise of the Nazi movement, which Elias Canetti was able to observe. The crowd instinct could thus be turned to politics. The symbol of the instrumentalization, thus, of masses of people was that constant ideal held up by ideological movement of masses on the march. Machines would also play a role. And by machines here, used by the mass movements, we mean not only machines in the literal sense, but also the whole apparatus of modern technology, including the use of media for propaganda. We'll discuss in our lectures how a succession of modern media, the print media, radio, film, then television, would be used and abused by mass movements for their propaganda purposes and to sway minds. Furthermore, machines could also include the sheer organizational power of the modern bureaucratic state, with its capacity to organize, to conduct censuses, to keep people under surveillance, especially the organized police and secret services. Having considered the tools by which these movements would come to power, let's turn to examine the two other key elements that would constitute the motives, or the ultimate aims. These were the mobsters and the master plans. By mobsters, we mean the movement's elite itself, including the leaders of these mass movements, who quite self-consciously gathered into organized conspiracies to achieve political power. And in doing so, they often used criminal methods that had been inspired by gangster bosses or organized crime. We'll see again and again that the leaders of these mass movements would also, in gangster or mobster fashion, subscribe to personal moralities, which set them above the morality that applied to the ordinary run of mankind. They would seek their power as one of their goals, but this would be, in the minds of these leaders, identified with the realization of master plans. Master plans were the ideologies that were championed by mass movements. They were the total blueprints for the future based on their ideas, promising utopia as an outcome, with a comprehensive vision of a future society that was intended to appeal to the masses. Such master plans were not necessarily inflexible. Indeed, they could be and often were adapted to changing conditions in their particulars, while still claiming to be infallible and fixed on a vision of the imagined future. As we've noted, such mass movements promised a lot to their followers and true believers. In particular, the confidence of knowing that they were headed in the direction that was fated by the very dynamics of history. This confidence, which is something that's not easy to quantify, would create an aura of dynamism, an aura of forward movement and propulsion that would be very important to the self-concept and to the triumph of these mass movements. Let's keep in mind that while there certainly had been tyrannies and cruel dictatorships before the 20th century, indeed human history is full of them, these movements, which we'll be discussing in our lectures, were nonetheless set apart. They were distinctively new and modern, principally because they could draw on new technologies of control and persuasion and ideologies that claimed to be scientific, new, progressive, and modern in their very essence. While we'll be discussing a whole succession of ideologies, we also want to be clear that this does not mean that the mass movements we will be discussing, such as, for instance, communism or Nazism, were all identical in nature. Very often they were ideological mortal enemies. Rather, it's especially because of their different ideological goals that we'll be struck again and again by the congruences in their actions and structures, the resemblances that will occur between movements that were nonetheless fighting one another. As we'll see again and again, these were movements that would struggle, combat one another, interact, and on occasion learn from or imitate one another. I want finally to consider just two psychological factors and reactions that we'll be returning to repeatedly in our lectures. The questions of confidence on the one hand and resistance on the other. Confidence as well as fear of these regimes are important factors in politics, though they're difficult, perhaps impossible to measure precisely. Mass movements would be able to exploit fears, especially by presenting themselves, even to their foes, as being inevitable in their triumph, and would be able to mobilize confidence on a scale that enabled crimes of a magnitude never witnessed before. It's a chilling thought to take aboard, that such crimes could be committed out of aspiration and hope for a future vision, rather than from desperation alone. And yet, even in spite of such confidence projected by the regimes, people would still resist. Not often an easy task, especially when the claim to triumph seemed so plausible on the part of these mass movements. Such regimes are, thankfully, not the only story of the 20th century. Resistance to such regimes, in many cases ultimately leading to their overthrow, is also a crucial and inspiring story of the 20th century. And resistance could come in many forms. It could include active opposition. It could include as well something as ordinary as jokes directed against the repressive regime, which still testified, even in their bitter humor, to a certain inner reserve of resistance within that had not been quelled by the regime. And then, also significant for our purposes, the sort of quieter witness of people who thought, reflected on, and wrote about the atrocities of their age and its violent trajectory. One witness of the age, among others whom we'll be considering in our lectures, was among the first to try this difficult and ambitious intellectual task of trying to discern the century's broader outlines. She was a controversial political philosopher by the name of Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish scholar and refugee from Nazi Germany who came to the United States, who drew on her personal observations and experiences to dissect traits of what she called the century's totalitarian movements, regimes that would aim, at least, for total control. Her work is, I think, of decisive impact and significance to understanding the 20th century. Further, there will be witnesses in fictional form, those such as Yevgeny Zamyatin, Aldous Huxley, or George Orwell, who wrote in the form of fiction their own anxieties, their own premonitions of what the human future might appear like, given the violent trajectories of their days. We reach thus our point of departure, and we'll need to keep in mind certain features of the story that we'll be examining in these lectures. One very important caution is to keep in mind that the 20th century was not only about violence, but it did see unprecedented levels of it. We will seek to trace, to follow this blood-red thread running through the fabric of our times to understand what deeper lessons it might yield for us. And in the process, two opposed observations, in tension with one another, need to be kept in mind throughout. The first is this: the overthrow of many of the regimes, which we will discuss in our lectures, testifies not only to the acknowledged heroism of resistors, or the witnesses whom we'll be discussing, who oppose these regimes, but also tells us something else. It signifies to us that there's a certain inner instability in the regimes themselves, which start to believe their own propaganda, start to lose a sense of the limits of reality, and thus ultimately might fall prey to their own utopian wishes. The second opposed observation is this, and it's an insight which is perhaps not an optimistic one. The repeated rise of such regimes, again and again, with humanity seemingly not learning from what's come before, points to another disturbing phenomenon: the apparent recurring susceptibility of modern societies and modern people to such impulses, even today, suggesting some inner flaw in modern man. Perhaps consciousness of this susceptibility might be one of the first steps towards remedying it. We've sought in this lecture to define our terms and establish major themes. In our next lecture, we'll consider the legacy of revolutions in world history, especially in the 19th century, that would launch the world on the course of the violent 20th century.